Okay, so for this demo, I want to take a deeper dive on the shape layer. Okay, so I cleared everything out, and I'm going to draw. Sure, grid is on. Draw shapes here. Okay, so the whole point of this is to animate things. So to animate stuff, we need to transform it or move it in the picture space. Um, and as we start manipulating the transformations, you'll start to understand a little bit, hopefully, a little bit better how shape layers work in After. So, okay, so I got my two shapes, and they're in one layer. And if I want to see what's in there, there's hotkeys and stuff, but we'll do it manually first. There's a little toggly thing over here. So if I put that down, I see, okay, there's contents. There's two rectangles and then a transform. Do transform. Okay, so we have an anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. And there's a little mnemonic to remember all these things and the hotkeys that go with them called TARPs. So A for anchor point, P for position, S for scale, R for rotation, and T for opacity. Why T for opacity? I have no idea. But transparency. Oh, there you go. Transparency. Oh, yeah, cool. TARPs. See, I learned something. All right. So, so let's see here. If I want to change these values, so when I roll over them, there's a my little arrow changes here, and I could move them around, right? So that's the X value, just like math class, right? And the Y, X and Y. There's the scale. There's rotation and opacity, and then there's this anchor. All right. So if we look at this here, just by having these two shapes within one layer, you'll start to understand what a shape layer is. The shape layer is kind of the collection of shapes within the layer. And the default transformation, so let's just hide this for a second. So remember TARPs, right? So if I wanted to find the position, I just hit P, right? The default transformations are for every single thing in that layer. So I would recommend for this first little mini project exercise here, just to keep life easy, to only have one shape per shape layer. All right, and so I'm gonna keep the square. So then the question becomes, okay, so I can move it, I can do whatever. And for this is a grid project. If we're going to move it, you could scrub the numbers, but you could see it's not actually sticking to the grid. I would actually just grab it and move it in the canvas, and it'll stick. But let's say we wanted to scale this thing, right? We don't want to scale it from there. At least I guess not. And let's say I wanted to spin it in the middle. If I spin it now, it's going to spin from the center of the canvas, from the center of this layer. So what I need to do is move the anchor point. And the anchor point is the kind of the point that is the point in space that the transformation occurs on. So to move the anchor point, I can scrub these numbers, right? But that's not really intuitive. And it actually moves the shape. Let's say we wanted to have the square right in the spot. We have to use this tool here called pan behind. So in After Effects, a lot of tools will behave differently depending on what is selected. I guess that'll just kind of manifest itself as we're looking at things. But for now, I'm going to select the shape layer. I'm going to select the pan behind tool. I'm going to grab this thing. And if I'm grabbing it out in the canvas here, it's going to snap to the grid, which is exactly what we want. And so now the anchor point's at negative 600, 180, I mean, whatever. But now when we rotate, it's going to rotate from that point in space. And when we scale, it'll scale from there. Alrighty. What else can we say? Okay, so now that the anchor point is kind of where we want it. Oh, whoops! I accidentally undid it. So if you want to redo something, you hit Command Shift Z. That'll go forward. So now that the anchor point is in the center of the square, if I want to go back to the Select tool, I just hit V, or I can go over here and click. So now look at the numbers of the transform position as I move the square. So when I'm in the upper left corner, that's 0, 0. So basically, that's the origin. That's the 0 point. One of the things that's a little confusing about animating on a computer is like how that 0 point behaves. If you're working in different software, sometimes the 0 point is in the center of the canvas. Sometimes the 0 point would be negative as you went down, but in After Effects, for whatever reason, 0 is in the top left corner, and as I move in the X increase, and as I move down in the Y increases. So 0 in the upper left corner. If we go to the bottom right corner, that's 1920 by 1080. That's also the size of the position. And if we're in the middle, it is going to be 960 by 540. So that's 1920 divided by 2 is 960, and 1080 divided by 2 is 540. All right, so let's look at these one by one. We already looked at the anchor point. We looked at position. To do scale, I can scale it up in here. Hold down Shift to keep the proportions, right? If I scrub down here, I can also change the scale. And, let's say I wanted it to snap right to the grid. There's no real way to do it at the moment. So what you need to do is use some multiple of 50. And then it's right in there, and then that just shows you can change the scale right in there. And if you want to have different numbers, you can do that and lock it in, and now it'll conserve. If you scrub, it'll keep those two combined together. So that's the scale. So, just to remind ourselves, if I move the anchor point, right, and then scale, that's going to change the behavior. The anchor points kind of has a lot to do with how things behave. All right, so that's scale. So the next one is rotation. And as I'm scrubbing this first little number here, it's like bouncing, but nothing's really happening. And the reason is this first number represents the number of rotations. So if I scrub the second number, you'll start to see what's happening. Right? So if I'm going, I get to 360, and then it's 1 rotation, 2 rotation, and so forth. All right. So that's rotation, and then opacity. 0 is none, 100 is all. Okay, so then if I want to set, so remember traps, right? So transparency, rotation is R, anchor point is A, position is P, and scale is S. All right, and I hit any of those keys and it brings up that attribute. So here's position. If I want to set a keyframe, I click on that little stopwatchy thing, and you see it turns blue, and there's a little diamond shaped thing in here. And basically what a keyframe is storing a value, storing a numeric value in time. And with one keyframe, nothing's happening because it's just the same value across time. But when we start changing those values at different points in time, see when I grab it, it makes this little line. We'll talk about that a little more in a second. that change in value between two different moments of time is what gives us the movement. Okay, and what's cool about the computer is, unlike stop motion, it'll interpolate, it'll blend between those values based on these function curves, which we'll look at later. Okay, so that's one way to set a position keyframe for position. Another way is just to hit, so P shows and hides, and then Alt P sets a keyframe, which is a little faster. All right. So any attribute, so Alt S can set a scale keyframe, or I can click the box and then Alt T, right? Any attribute, if you hit Alt, will set a key, or you can also do it with the stopwatch. If you have keyframes on, a few different values, and you want to see everything that's animated, so to hide everything, you hit U, right? And then to show all the animated parameters, you hit U again. And if you want to see anything that is outside the default, so for example, that there's a rectangle in this layer and yada yada, you hit U twice. All right, so that's the basics of shapes for now.